What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Dillard, coming back at you with another podcast. This is podcast number 23. I'm here with two awesome guests of mine, Mr. Max, and do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself first, Mr. Max?
Yes, my name is Max Greenfield. You can follow me on Twitter at GreenfieldMax18, and it's really great to be here.
Okay. And
And
then we also have my other guest, Mr. Jason.
this is Jason Fixell, and you can follow me on Twitter at ThatQuickFix.
Okay. And today we wanted to talk about some topics that are usually different. Most times when I have guests on here, we usually just discuss, breakdown from the series with the Yankees. We just did one with the Rays, and we usually just do the breakdowns of that. Sometimes we'll talk about the league in general. But today I specifically wanted to have these two as the main stage. They're going to be the ones mainly talking about their new concept, I would say, or their new statistic called gWAR and kWAR. They have an article about it. I will actually link it down in the description. So if you want to read more about it, you can definitely do it. Definitely follow them on Twitter and ask them more questions there. But I'm going to go ahead and give it to you guys now. So just go ahead and introduce to us what these statistics are, what they can do, and why they're good for baseball.
Sure. So it sort of started. I had an idea about creating a WAR statistic around the statistic called Sierra, but park factoring for that would be extremely difficult. So I kind of figured like maybe that's not the best way to go about it. And so I asked Tom Tango what are some predictors that he really likes, and he mentioned one called kWERA or kWAR. We're not entirely sure how it's pronounced. I've never heard it pronounced by the people who created it. So either pronunciation is fine. And so I was kind of doing the work on it, and then I put out on Twitter saying, I could use some help, and that's how I met Jason, who happened to work for the same team that I did, and I actually knew about Jason beforehand, and just sort of a small world coincidence.
It
Uh,
was it was really weird. Honestly, I don't even know how I ended up ever following Max on Twitter in the first place. Like
yeah,
he must have like appeared on my like Twitter timeline at some point. Someone must have liked one of his tweets, and I saw something that he posted and followed him. And then he posted about this project, and I reached out to him, and we just started getting to work on it, and really
yeah,
started diving in.
and it's been great ever since. Uh, we sort of worked out the details. We figured out how to go about what we needed to do with the park factoring quicker, and then obviously through a lot of just like plug and chug per se testing and figuring out what went right and what went wrong. We sort of got the first level the statistic out with 2019, and then Jason and I, we worked together with a few other people, and we decided to come out with another version of kWERAs called either ground ball kWA, GB Cleara, I don't, whatever. Again, we've never heard anybody pronounce these things, so whatever you want to call it. We created kWAR and gWAR, and so we're very happy with the project. I feel like it did what we thought it would do, maybe not to the extent, but the goal of it was sort of creating a WAR statistic to potentially say uh, predicting next year's value, sort of being an indicator for either regression or progression. And it, in essence, it does do that a little bit, but maybe not to the extent that we thought. But yeah, that kWAR is using kWERA and gWAR uses GBKWERA, and we sort of created a WAR statistic beyond that.
Okay. And what exactly about kWAR and gWAR is, I would say, maybe similar to a stat that people are familiar with, such as fWAR? Like, what is the key components behind it that make it different and maybe a more viable option than fWAR?
I'll take this one, Max, and feel free to
Yeah.
jump in if you feel I'm misspeaking on anything. So the real differences between fWAR, kWAR, and gWAR are really in what ER estimator is used as the central component. So for fWAR, they use an adjusted version of FIP, or fielding independent pitching, where infield fly balls are added as strikeouts, and then a park factor is used to adjust FIP based on 50% is based on where the pitcher's home ballpark is, and 50% is based on the league average park factor. The difference for kWAR and gWAR is we use a different ER estimator. So at their cores, GB, kWERA, and kWERA are ER estimators just like Sierra, FIP, xFIP, and the like. We chose to use GB, kWERA, and kWERA because there's been research done that actually shows that those are more predictive of future ERA than FIP is. So if the logic behind, and I guess this kind of goes back to the difference between FWAR and RWAR or BWAR, so baseball references pitching WAR, which uses runs allowed 9 as its central component and then creates a WAR statistic from there. Fangraphs WAR was always thought to be a little bit more predictive than our WAR when it comes to pitchers. So we thought, why not push the envelope a little further and use an even more predictive metric as the central component. Also, a benefit to our calculation, it ends up being a little bit more time consuming, but we ended up making unique park factors for each pitcher. So for example, if you were to include someone in the NL West pitching, not an NL West pitcher, if you used their home ballpark and then 50% of their other appearances as being the league average park factor, you would be skewing their park factor a little bit because they actually pitch a lot more of their games in Coors Field relative to what the league average is, because it would be, like the impact of Coors is regressed down a little bit when you include them in all 15 to 30 teams, depending if you're using the league or MLB park factor. So what we did was we literally looked at every single appearance that a pitcher pitched in, how many plate appearances, how many batters they faced in each of those ballparks, and we created a weighted park factor based on where they actually pitched to hopefully make the park factor a little bit more accurate and avoid any biases that could come from pitchers having an abnormal amount of appearances in a ballpark with an extreme park factor.
Okay, so it's basically kind of like a... Go ahead, Max.
I just wanted to piggyback on that and say, I feel Jason and I kind of agree that a flaw of F4 is that sort of 50-50 split. And I still, like, I've talked to people and I said, I don't really know why that is. Like, there's plenty of people, like, it's, yes, sure, it's more time consuming, but it feels sort of dishonest, especially to pitchers in the NL West or even to, pitchers that played in the AL East back in the day, right? With Yankee Stadium, Fenway Park, and Camden Yards being relatively more hitter's parks in sort of the eras before today, right? And it feels sort of like disingenuous to the process of how we evaluate players to just sort of say, yes, 50% is at their home ballpark, 50% is sort of league average, because it doesn't always work out like that.
Yeah, and although I definitely agree with Max on that, I do want to point out that it probably doesn't have like the largest impact because the way the park factors are set up, even the extremes aren't all that relatively different. For example, like the park factors range, for example, for walks from, in 2019 from 94 to 104. So you're really within a pretty tight band, right? So if 100 is, average, you're really, 6% below and 4% above. It's not going to move the needle terribly in either direction, but at least by, taking the extra step to, create these unique weighted park factors, it's trying to at least more accurately portray the impact of parks on these pitchers' performances.
Okay, so it's pretty much the pitcher's form of WRC plus in a sense. Like WRC plus kind of more punishes players who play in a hitter's friendly ballpark such as Coors compared to someone like I always use the same reference between Arenado and Chapman. You can have your own debates on whether who's better, but we can definitely admit that Arenado is highly benefited by Coors Field, while Chapman definitely plays in a more pitchers-friendly ballpark. And you could make the argument that someone like Chapman is better than Arenado because Arenado's road-to-home splits are significantly different. So it's kind of like that in a sense, but it's just for pitchers, basically, right? Kind
of. I we're not going to go down this rabbit hole. I'm sure we could have a whole podcast debating this about the actual impact of Coors Field on hitters. And, you see like hitters leave Coors Field and perform even better for someone like DJ LeMahieu, as I'm sure, being a Yankees guy, you've seen his transition. The ball moves differently in Coors, so that they when they're in Coors Field, like it's almost like they have to face two different leagues. They have two different approaches. Setting that aside, the idea being that park factors are kind of like WRC plus in that they are they're like weighted to a league average of 100, and 25% above would be a WRC plus of 125 is 25% above the league average. A park factor of 107 means that there are 7% more strikeouts there than the league average park. That's exactly what we're kind of getting at with the park factor adjustment.
Okay. And how many pitchers exactly have you already, made the exact calculations for both gWAR and kWAR?
Anybody who threw a pitch from 2002 to 2019, we have accounted for. So I guess if I went into Fangraphs and quickly pulled up, set the minimum to 0 innings pitched from 2002 to 2019, however many pitchers that is, it's gotta be.
Yeah. I don't know.
It's a lot of pitchers.
It's a lot of pitchers, obviously. I think that, for example, in 2019, there was 831 pitchers that we did these calculations for. Obviously, 2019 was the highest number of pitchers that we've seen in our 2002 to 2019 sample, as, relievers have become more specialized and more pitchers are pitching, period. We've seen kind of a growth in the number of pitchers who actually played each year. So,
okay,
yeah, it was kind of like it didn't have any like sort of like statistical relevance or in terms of our analysis 2002, but it was kind of funny just seeing the number of pitchers in 2002 versus 2019, even going back to a year like 2010 versus 2019. It's pretty interesting just to see that there are 200 to 300 more pitchers last year than there were in just a decade ago, and that's just it sort of made it fun to see how much the game has changed. And it was also sort of fun to just sort of kind of whenever somebody brings up an argument of like pitchers today aren't as good as they used to be, I'm like, there are more strikeouts and less walks now than there have ever been at any point in the history of the game. Hitting is extremely difficult nowadays. But in terms of like the original question about the total number of pitchers, I think on any given year it was sort of in the range of like 600 to 700 pitchers ish for the most part. You had a few outliers, some years less, some years more.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
And did you also include positional players who came out to pitch?
Anybody who threw a pitch.
Yeah.
They were not included in our analysis, but we did include them in just the leaderboards just in case if anybody wanted a good laugh.
Yeah. Most of these players also, like, in order to have been included in our analysis, you would have had to have pitched in consecutive seasons anyway. So not many position players are pitching year over year. And even if they were, for our purposes, we ended up limiting the players that we looked at to a certain number of total batters faced, just so that we could, kind of eliminate any small sample size noises from people who kind of just show up one year.
And from your calculations, you said since 2002, is there anything that you found that was significantly different from 2002 to 2003 compared to maybe 2018 to 2019?
I think just the total number of strikeouts seemingly kept going up as we kept getting closer to now. But obviously from like 2002 to 2004, the walk number was a little thrown off because a guy named Barry Bonds was just getting walked so much. It was crazy to look at. I was like, why are there so many walks? And then I remember that like maybe even a quarter of them were just coming from one guy. So it's, I had to kind of like remember that. But as we kind of went along, I mean, it sort of just reflected what's going on in baseball now, right? True outcomes are more popular now than they really ever were before. And it's sort of like just seeing the raw data sort of reflected that.
Yeah, I think that's true. Like for, in order to calculate kWERA and GB kWERA, we actually had to set a league constant. And so part of that part of that calculation required us looking at like the total number of strikeouts, walks, and the total ground ball percentage across the league. And so every year I felt like the number of strikeouts went up and the number of walks, kind of went down, stayed the same. So it's just interesting. Like you see how the game has kind of changed looking at the data year over year and how people's approaches have changed, right? It used to be, hey, try to pitch to contact, like get the ball on the ground, which getting the ball on the ground is still good. And that's why there's value in having, high ground ball percentage. But now you're seeing, the, higher velocity, high spin fastballs at the top of the zone, high spin curveballs below, that vertical movement that's kind of getting more focused on getting whiffs and strikeouts. And that's really pervaded the game in a way and driven, kind of this focus.
This question might be different, might receive a different answer from both of you. But I was curious and wanted to ask, out of all the pitchers that you've done since basically 2002, were there any outliers that you were maybe surprised by how high their gWAR or kWAR was?
That's a good question.
It is a good question. There was someone, honestly, like once you started going back to like the older years, right? You start like thinking like, wow, that pitcher was like really that good. Like I think it might not have been like someone, I don't necessarily know whether he had a high, like a big difference, but like I forgot about like Eric Bedard, for example. Like he was actually a really good pitcher for a while. And like you just forget about those kind of players. So looking back at the older years, it's kind of like a nice like little blast from the past when you look at the leaderboard.
Yeah, Ben Sheets appeared pretty high. I think he finished like top 10 like 2 years in a row in kWAR, gWAR, and I was just like, oh yeah, Ben Sheets was really good for a hot second there, wasn't he? For the let's say for the Yankee fans that are listening, you'll be happy to know that Masahiro Tanaka appeared quite a bit in the top or top part of the leaderboard pretty consistently from like 2015 to 2018. I saw his name pop up a lot and I was just sort of like, oh yeah, he's been pretty consistent for a while. He not in 2019, the ball really kind of hurt his numbers, but yeah, I mean, I think it was just as Jason said, like you'd go back and just see all those names and you'd be like, oh yeah, that guy was really good. Like Roy Halladay, I think he was like first or second every year in gWAR for like 3 straight years, like just proving how dominant he was.
Yeah. I pulled up a random year on Excel, and for example, the 2012 leader for gWAR was James Shields. A little blast for the past from him, and his gWAR was actually almost 2 wins higher than his F4. So
wow, that's significant too. Like that's huge.
Yeah. Every year we did have some kind of we did have like a pretty wide range of difference between anywhere from -2 to 2 win differences on some players. And you can guess on some of those on the extremes, right? Someone, for example, like Aaron Bummer, who has like an insane ground ball percentage. He's going to be someone who F4 is always not going to love because he doesn't strike out a ton of guys, but he's just constantly just killing worms,
And I guess this might be a good time to let you guys explain this because it's your stat. But I definitely would love to hear this because a lot of people, more often than not, I know especially Max knows this with Yankees Twitter, but a lot of people definitely don't seem to appreciate Zach Britton. How high was his numbers as far as gWAR is concerned because of his high ground ball rate?
He's up there. He's someone who, looking back at his like elite, it was 2016 or 2017 when he was with the Orioles, when he had that absurd line. Like he was, like the best reliever in baseball the year by far. He's consistently someone who does very, very well on the gWAR side. On the kWAR side, doesn't really get, at least in my opinion, the credit he deserves, because he is someone who, he doesn't strike out a ton of people relative to the league average. I think he's either around league average, maybe slightly below. He's someone who constantly runs extremely high ground ball percentages and someone who is consistently going to perform well. I know being a Yankee fan, I know that there are a lot of Zach Britton haters out there, and especially in the context of, with these new extra inning rules, maybe you don't throw someone like Zach Britton out there in the 10th when there's already someone on second base because, he can give up a ground ball that squeaks through. I think that Zach Britton is someone over the course of a full season who's going to always provide great value, especially if he can, get his strikeout numbers to tick back up to where he was in his elite 2016 season.
Yeah, I mean, he pretty much had a gWAR around or over 2 like every year just because he's such a high ground ball pitcher. And is that maybe like his F4 is not as good and his kWAR is not as good. So it's sort of like finding that balance. Is he as good as the gWAR says? Maybe not necessarily, but that's probably closer to his real talent level just because he relies and gets such ground ball contact all the time. It's not that he's like limiting hard contact. It's just it's always on the ground. So, if he gives up a shot, but it's hit right at Gio Urshela or right at G.J. LeMahieu, it doesn't really matter, right? He got the job done, and that's what he's able to do. So yeah, it was funny when we first did the stat for the released just kWAR. It like hated Zach Britton, said he was a negative value pitcher, and like immediately it caught both of our eyes of like that's probably not true, right? Like we were like, there's no way that Zach Britton's a negative WAR pitcher. And then when we created gWAR, we were sort of like, yeah, that's probably a little bit better. And a guy like Dallas Keuchel actually pops up too because his F4 doesn't really like him because again he gets a lot of ground balls and not a lot of strikeouts and stuff. He lives at the edge of the zone and he relies on that weak contact. And so gWAR seemed to probably show that Keuchel's got a little bit more left in him just because he relies on the ground ball contact. But yeah, I mean, ground ball pitchers by estimators are maybe sometimes a little undervalued if they don't get a lot of strikeouts. If you're getting a lot of strikeouts and you get a lot of ground balls, then obviously you're just every indicator is going to say you're a good pitcher, right? But sort of it's what the nice thing about both these statistics are is like it may point you in a direction or to a player that you didn't necessarily think of as going to be good.
Yeah, and I think that kind of underscores the entire like point, and I think one of our big conclusions is that these are just another tool in your analytical tool belt, right? If you live or die by any single metric, you're just not analyzing the game in a way that's going to allow you to, make good decisions when thinking about players. I think, for example, if you lived and died by, FIP, FIP's a great metric. It's actually, very, very good. It's better than ERA, predicting future ERA. But if you consistently look at someone who's outperforming their FIP and your answer is, well, FIP's right, this person's just, eventually going to, turn. No, you have to like dig in a little deeper and try to understand, what goes into the metric. What is the metric excluding? What is the metric considering? And are there things outside of that metric that would explain what is actually happening on the field? And I think that those are the important lessons that Max and I kind of gathered from doing this, especially I think, when we looked at kWAR and we were like, Zach Britton's not a negative value pitcher. And, we don't expect Zach Britton to be a negative value pitcher. Like what is going wrong here and how can we adjust this to, take a more holistic and overall approach?
Yeah, I think Jason nailed it on the head with just like, don't look at just one metric, right? It's sort of helpful to look at all metrics. And it's sort of just, at a certain point, a guy's ERA could be like 3.3 and his estimators are like 3.6 or 3.8, right? All higher. And all of a sudden it's like his 6th year of constantly doing this. And you could look at, that's hopefully our goal is to like look at every metric and sort of find that explanation of why he always overperforms his FIP or his STIR or something like that, right? But it's also just sort of at some point, guys just overperform. Like offensively speaking, we sort of talk about regressing to the mean, right? When we look at somebody's like DRC plus, or we look at their xWOBA and say, or their hard hit rate, barrel rate, whatever. Like we look at all these indicators and walk percentage to like sort of figure out what's going to come next. Some guys just consistently overperform it, and right, and the answer is just that's who they are. That could still happen here with pitching, right? You could still have guys who are going to consistently have a lower ERA than their estimators are, and that's just going to happen. Does it mean that they're going to regress at some point? Maybe, maybe not. But I sort of like agree with Jason that don't look at just like SIERA or FIP or PCRA or DRA and say, well, they're all higher, right? Well, why are they higher? Can you explain why they're higher? If you can't explain why they're higher, they're just like, well, they're higher, so they should regress. Okay, but is it because of sample size? Is it because of they're limiting hard contact well, or do they just have a really good, like Dakota Hudson just has a really good defense behind him, right? And that's part of, like, he gets a lot of ground balls and he has a really good defense. Yes, he walks a lot of guys, and that's inherently a bad thing, but he has a really good defense behind him. So he's a guy who could always sort of like outdo his, peripherals because, yeah, he gets a lot of help. Maybe that's not necessarily fair in sort of player evaluation, but if you can't explain why, then, you're kind of just doing yourself a disservice.
Yeah. And I think that's the point of analyzing players, right? We create these metrics and we apply them the same way to each individual player, but each individual player gets to where they are in a different way, right? There's like, we try to reduce a very complicated game with a lot of different outcomes and processes into one statistic, and inherently we're going to be ignoring valuable information because there's no way to coalesce all of that information in a way the same way for each person to create a metric that truly measures exactly how they are, right? So there's always going to be variation or flaws, not flaws within these statistics, but like these statistics aren't going to explain everything because they don't encompass everything. We try to like pick and choose the things that are the most predictive and try to, ignore some things that, maybe vary a lot more, right? Strikeouts, walks, and ground balls are three things that pitchers really, really do have a good handle on and are pretty stable on a year-to-year basis. It would be great if we could include other individual things and try to, use those to predict future events, but it becomes very, very difficult to do that. And that's why, you look at these statistics and you should say, this tells me something. Let's talk about the broader picture. What am I missing? What can I add in? Why does this maybe not explain what I think that I saw or what actually happened?
Yeah, just to have a final point, they tried to create a fifth metric that sort of accounted for everything that a pitcher could possibly control, and I think it's called cFIP. I think, yeah, and just like reading about how it's calculated, it seems like it would take forever because you got to count. If you really wanted to go into everything a pitcher could hypothetically control, right? That's a real question when we talk about pitching metrics: is what can pitchers really control per se? But you have to account for the fact that the strike zone is set by the umpire. You have to account for that on any given day you could have wind blowing out or in. On any given day you could have maybe not your best defenders out there or something, right? And so there's all these things you have to consider, and so you sort of just like come to the conclusion, at least in my head, that pitching is really hard, right? And that you just sort of had to understand of like, all right, it's too much to look at everything, so let me look for like a few factors here and there that are inherently good things and bad things, and sort of like, if I can explain it with those, great. If I have to go beyond that, then I will. But don't try and overthink it. Like don't say like, well, since Tyler Wade's playing shortstop instead of Gleyber Torres, pitchers might do well. Maybe, but like, are we really gonna like factor that into how we evaluate pitchers, right? Like that shouldn't really matter. But that's, some people try and do that, and that's really hard.
That being said, I do like cFIP. I think
I like cFIP too, but it's just sort of like
cool.
I think the people who, like, when they created that, I can't imagine that conversation.
Yeah.
Right. Like, hey, you want to do this? And just like, no, I don't want to do that.
No. cFIP is cool for people who haven't looked at it. It's there's an article on the Hardball Times from Jonathan Judge back in 2015 explaining cFIP. I think it's a good read.
Okay. And you guys can definitely link me that, and I'll actually put that down in the description because I actually haven't read about that either. So I will definitely find that pretty fascinating.
cFIP's really cool to look at, but whenever someone asks me to like try and explain it to them, I just sit there and say, it does a lot. That's what I say.
It's just too complicated to explain. There's too many factors.
Yeah, Jonathan Judge is also a lawyer like myself, so it's nice to see other lawyers doing this kind of thing. So maybe I'm biased.
It's a good reason to be biased, though.
Yeah.
I actually have a very interesting question for you guys. This will probably be like the last question because it's definitely something that I've pondered and thought about. What did the numbers show for James Paxton and J-Hap for last year? Or did you guys have you done some calculations over the 2020 season? I know they've been, a very small sample size, but is there any, I guess what I'm trying to say is there any common factor that you could point towards, like, for example, Paxton, his velocity isn't seeming to reach where he usually reaches, or someone like Hap. Like, Hap is one of those guys I just can't explain. Like, is it his confidence? I know that he walks too many guys. He doesn't seem to have that confidence to paint, the edges in the strike zone and the corners more. So is there any, like, information about Paxton and J-Hap that might explain why they're performing so poorly?
I'm sure Jason's pulling up, but just off the top of my head, I think Paxton his kWAR and his gWAR were pretty much right at his fWAR last year. So he was pretty much what you got was what you should have gotten. Mm-hmm. At Hap, he was pretty much, I know that the ERA looked bloated and everything, but he was relatively an average pitcher-ish last year. Mm-hmm. In terms of like looking at the numbers, I know Paxton in like 2017 or 2018 was really good, like really, really, really good. And he showed up in the top of the leaderboard there. I mean, Paxton's recovering from back surgery in that regard. So, like, the velocity, it's going to take a little bit just to get back, just because back surgery is complicated. With regards to Hap, I don't think our metrics can really sort of tell you anything other than what the other metrics tell you, that he's probably just getting old. Like, that's probably the truth with Hap, is he's 30. What is he, like 35, 36-ish, right? And it's just, he's on the wrong side of that age, and age has finally caught up to him.
Yeah, I think that's probably about right. Looking at Hap's statistics from last year, his fWAR was 1.3, his gWAR was 1.7, and then his kWAR was actually 2.0. I guess that makes kind of sense too when you think about the kind of pitcher that Hap is. And Paxton and Hap are kind of similar pitchers in terms of their approach. They're heavy on the fastballs, try to live at the top of the zone. So those are guys that kWAR and kWRA are gonna kind of favor, because those tend to be high strikeout approaches. With Hap, obviously he's getting older. The velocity is declining. His spin rate declined last year. And, for a guy who, really thrives on living up in the zone with a high spin fastball, any losses, there's a difference between 94 and an above average spin rate at the top of the zone, and 92 and still above average spin rate, but lower than what it was. So for a guy like him, who really, really does rely on that fastball, as it gets worse, he's going to kind of get worse. As for Paxton, Max, I think, hit the nail on the head. He's, coming back from back surgery. He got his elbow thing going on right now. I read something that he actually, and like you can see it if you look, compare his delivery between this year and last year. His release point is lower this year. I don't know if there's any sort of, discomfort, any change in his mechanics that, resulted from the back surgery, and whether he's, truly comfortable with his mechanics. Like, he kept on saying that he felt fine, and that it just like wasn't there. So it's possible that they're, he's obviously going to be out for a little bit with the flexor strain, and hopefully he can come back and kind of get back into his old mechanics and find that lost velocity. Because again, someone who very fastball dominant, there's a big difference when you're averaging 96 miles an hour on your fastball versus averaging 91, 92. I don't think he actually has thrown a fastball this year that even is faster than his average fastball last year. So, that's really kind of where I would see it. And I think Max was also right. He's someone where his F4 and his kWAR were about the same, and I think his gWAR was maybe a tick below that, just because, again, a high fastball pitcher who doesn't really generate a ton of ground balls.
What I would say to Yankee fans about Paxton with Hap, it's just sort of like, you just got to take the loss on that. It's just, a guy who relied on a high fastball, lost his spin, probably lost some efficiency or active spin rate on it too. So it means it kind of drops into the zone a little bit more. And, you just either he's got to live down in the zone now and get ground balls, or he's just not going to be a big league pitcher anymore. With Paxton, I would say the velocity will come back, right? The Yankees, Matt Blake, and their training staff have made clear that like it'll come back eventually, right? And you had sort of seen it in his last few starts, like the velocity before he got hurt was starting to creep back up slowly and slowly. But I would also say, like, on the open market, if this were a normal year, right, he probably would have gotten a pretty good deal. But because of this injury with the back and now with the elbow, I would tell Yankee fans you are more inclined to re-sign Paxton than ever, because he's going to be a lot cheaper than what he probably should have been. However, as people are hoping to still work for the Nationals next year, I would also advise my bosses to please sign James Paxton.
I don't know if they have room in that rotation.
No, yeah, well, and Anibal pitched fairly well today, even though I think he probably calls it a career after this year. I was surprised he didn't. But he pitched well, and yeah, their rotation at full health is very, very good. But I'm not here to discuss the Nationals off-season plans, though I do think I think I know what their priority will be, just because I think if you're not the White Sox or even like the Yankees or Cubs, your priority should probably be JT Realmuto. But that's just a guess. Like, I don't really know. But back to the original question. Yeah, I mean, Jason nailed it. Just high spin fastball who relies up in the zone with curveball and cutter sort of down and in. Paxton should be okay. Hap, it seems just like age.
Yeah, relevant on Hap, I actually just pulled up his StatCast. In 2018, his four-seam fastball rose 1.6 inches more than an average fastball in his kind of velocity bucket. In 2019, that was 1.2, and in 2020, it's down to 0.6. So his fastball is losing its differentiation between other fastballs. So it seems like that's becoming less and less of a valuable pitch for him.
Which would be just an indicator of just age.
Old.
Yeah, it sucks. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I don't know about for you guys, but like, I like to, when I talk publicly about players, I like to just say good things and stuff. Maybe it's just because like I don't want to be in that awkward position of when I have to meet with them if I'm working in a front office and be like, hey, how come you tweeted this about me like 3 years ago, right? I don't really want that to happen. But yeah, I mean, with Hap, I understand the frustrations, right? Like, it's just, if you're a Yankee fan, he pitched really well for you in 2018 and in the second half of the season, and then 2019 he just sort of like fell off a cliff out of nowhere. But the reality is, like, there were warning signs. B, this stuff is just decreased because he's old. Like, it's just the reality of it. Like, sometimes you just have to tell the truth.
It's just another
time marches on.
It's just basically like another CC Sabathia situation where it's just like you're the wrong side of 30, basically.
Yeah, but like the thing about CC was he sort of learned how to pitch without the velocity. He developed that cutter, he developed that slider. And CC's, I think, up until 2019, his numbers were still relatively solid, relatively fine. Like, for like a 4 or 5, he was still pretty good for a 4 or 5 in the rotation. And then in 2019, it was just sort of like he admitted like he only came back to try and win. And it was like, it was obvious watching him pitch. It was just like, there's nothing left in that tank, which is fine. He's a Hall of Famer. He doesn't need have anything left to prove. But like, I think that, sort of the nice thing about new age metrics is you can sort of catch on a little bit sooner when things are going to start to go bad.
Yeah, there are indicators for that kind of decline, and usually what you can also, as a shorthand, you can just look at like how old they are. And usually that means once they get older, they're not going to do so great.
Yeah.
Very few people beat Father Time.
Yeah, Nelson Cruz still hitting at his age is pretty amazing.
Okay,
amazing.
Yeah.
So I guess just one last question. It's not relative to statistics, but more to let the viewers know about you guys personally. I guess just answer some questions about yourself. What made you decide to get into baseball in general? Why do you like baseball so much? Why are you so fascinated with analytics? And also, both of you were working for the Nationals at some point, so I'm sure you guys have some wonderful stories about working with the Nationals.
I'll let Jason tell his story of how he got into baseball, because I love it. I think it's so funny and cool how Jason got into baseball, and it's just such an odd story. So I want him to go first.
All right. So I'm a lawyer. I work at a big law firm in New York City. And when I was really, really busy at work in 2018, I was really just fed up with work. I'd been working, until 3 a.m. every day for 2 straight weeks. I looked online. I always wanted to work in baseball, and I was like, baseball operations jobs. And I found a job online with the Yankees, and I applied for it. And I somehow ended up getting an interview. I went to Yankee Stadium, and I was like, maybe I can actually do this. Maybe this is something that it's always been the dream, and maybe I can actually go about doing this the right way. And so I applied for a bunch more jobs. I applied for a job with the Nationals. I went to the winter meetings. I had a couple interviews with some teams. Didn't get anything at the winter meetings. Hadn't heard back from the Nationals. This was January, and I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna, I guess, work at my law firm for the whole year again and try again. I re-signed a lease in New York, and 2 days later, I get an email from the Nationals asking me to do an interview, and then I did another interview, and then 2 weeks later, I had to break my lease and move down to DC.
Wow, that's incredible. That's awesome, man.
Yeah, worked out pretty well. I worked with the team for about a month before the season was shut down. So unfortunately, I got laid off. But the guys at the Nationals have been super great about everything. They've actually we've shared our work with them and gotten some feedback from them, which has been great. I'm actually golfing with 2 people from the baseball operations department tomorrow morning before work, playing a quick 9.
Nice.
Before I get back to the desk. I hope none of my employers are going to be listening to this podcast. It'll probably happen it'll probably get posted after tomorrow anyway. So even if they are, trust me, I was working on the golf course.
Jason's too nice and modest to admit where he went to law school, just offhand, but I have to do it just because I have to hype up my partner, and he's just an incredibly brilliant man. Jason went to Harvard, so he's very, very, very smart. He would never tell you that, but he is very, very smart. He told me his story, and I thought it was hysterical because his boss is sort of like my boss too. He worked with both of us, but his boss was at the winter meetings, and when Jason told me that he didn't meet with our boss at the winter meetings, I was like, well, that's weird, because I did. And I wasn't even interviewing for the role that he technically oversees, but it was because his boss was filling in for technically my boss at the meetings. They had to do interviews. But to explain how I worked at Sports Info Solutions last year, which is a data analytics company for sports. They now do baseball, basketball, and football. And it was really great. And a lot of guys who go from there go on to work for teams, usually in the minor league video department, just because you have experience with video and how to work it and everything. So, I interviewed with a few different teams with their video department. Jason, the job Jason talked about with the Yankees, I got a questionnaire for and met with their baseball ops coordinator to talk about with this past year. And, there were some good interviews and stuff, and I heard some follow-ups, and but the Nationals were the one I had most heavily talked to. I think either during the World Series or right after the NLCS, I met with my boss James on the phone. He called me at 7 o'clock in the morning, my time, 10 a.m. his time. And, it's kind of funny picking up the phone. I'm like, hey, James. And he's like, sorry, it's so early. And, I'm like still kind of half awake and stuff. So, we talked on the phone, and I thought it went well. And then I talked with our boss and or Jason's boss and another guy. And then I met with them at the winter meetings. But after the winter meetings, I took my girlfriend to Disneyland for the first time in her life. And on the way to Disneyland, I got an email from my boss, and I was like, oh God, please don't tell me I got cut like on the way to Disneyland. Man, that would be such a terrible way to spend my first day at the happiest place on earth, is like figuring out I didn't get the job. And I like Jason's right. The people at the Nationals are just so nice. They treat us so well, and like they were, listen, there are a lot of people who are in a lot worse shape than I am and other people. And, I'm lucky for my health and stuff. But they felt so legitimately bad for us that they had to let us go. Like they were telling us like, this is not what we wanted. Like, this is not at all. Like, and if we can bring you back, we will absolutely try and do that. And I really appreciated that. And it started with these interviews. Like, they were all really nice and respectful. And I had made clear to them, like, listen, if you offer me the job, I'm taking it. Like, you guys are where I want to work and everything. So then I got back from Disneyland, and I had until January 1st to let SIS know if I was coming back or not. And so I emailed my boss and I said, I got 4 days to let them know if I'm taking the job again. He's like, all right, you'll be getting a phone call from the assistant GM, Mark Shalaba, at some point in the next day or two. I was like, oh, okay. At this point, this is my 4th interview with them. 4th. Like, all my other friends who got jobs at other teams, they had 2 interviews and then got the job. I was on my 4th. And I was just sort of like, man, this is a long process for the Nationals. And so, but then 3 hours later, Shalaba calls me. We talk on the phone for about 20 minutes, have a great conversation. And the next day I got the job. But everyone at the Nationals, every single person is so nice. I tell Nationals fans all the time, you're rooting for such a great organization. Everyone was super nice. They obviously, it's not their fault that a pandemic happened, right? It's not, this is completely out of their control. And so, but even though they knew that, they still felt just so genuinely bad for not just Jason and I, but pretty much everyone they had to let go. They were just sort of we're so sorry. This is not what we had all had in mind. And I don't know if that's everyone's experience working in baseball, right? Jason and I got really lucky that we work for an organization like the Nationals, but people I've talked to have sort of said it's, once you work in baseball, it's a tight knit community, right? You meet a bunch of people and they're all really nice and they're all trying to help, right? So my advice, it might be different for Jason, but my advice for people trying to get into baseball is what is important, but who you are as a person, if you're nice, if you're respectful, if you're smart enough, right? But it's more just don't be a dick, just. The people at the National, my boss basically just told me we liked who you were as a person. Your baseball knowledge is, we knew that after the first or second interview, whether or not it was up to shape. Who you are as a person mattered more to us. And that seemed to be a theme throughout anybody I talked to for any team, was just your baseball knowledge gets you past the first step. It's who you are as a person that gets you where you want to go.
Yep. I think that's exactly right. I met with quite a few teams, and I think that if you are fortunate enough to get to the position where you're interviewing with a team, the questions aren't, the questions about your baseball knowledge aren't really the driving factor. It's, who you are as a person, be a good person, good things will happen. And I couldn't agree with Max more. I think the Nationals handled this whole situation with us with, just the purest of class. So I couldn't have been happier to have been part of an organization like that, even though it was only for a month. And if I do have an opportunity to go back, I think that would be amazing. I still live in DC now. That's I guess a vestige of this whole situation. I haven't really seen that much of DC, so I'm excited, for things to hopefully get to a point where, as a society, we can, start doing more things. But
wear a mask, people. Wear a mask. Socially distance.
Wear a mask, everybody.
Please. Yeah, I mean, seriously, if you take anything away from Jason and I's sort of experience of what to do to get into baseball, it's just be a good person. Like these people, they don't take the time out of their day to meet with just anybody. So be respectful of that. Like they're meeting with you because they want to talk to you. Don't just like brush aside that. Be grateful for that. Like every interview I got, I told every single person, like, thank you so much. Like this means so much to me on my way to what I want to do in life. And like whether or not this works out, I'm still grateful for the opportunities. And every team that, you know what, that didn't give me an offer or anything, like I'm still grateful that I had that chance, right? You learn something out of every interview that you do. And also just like you sort of like, these are people you meet that can help you down the line, whether or not it's trying to get a job. It's just like, hey, like I've been working on this project. I don't know if like you would have any knowledge about this, but you know, could you possibly send me to somebody who might? And if you were nice enough, they will. If you weren't, they're not even going to answer. Like this is just this good life advice is just be respectful, but especially in baseball, these people talk to each other, right? They talk to each other. So be nice. And luckily the Nationals were so incredibly nice. So that really made it. I was only there, like I felt Jason and I actually knew of Jason before he sent me a message because his boss on my last day in Florida at spring training was so worried about trying to get Jason work to do and getting him started. He's like, we got this guy who worked at a law firm as our baseball ops intern. And he goes, and I feel so horrible that it's all going down. I'm just hoping I can get him some work to do. Like, I'm just so stressed about this. And I'm really hopeful I can get Jason some work to do. And I was like, man, I'd hate to be that guy right now, right? Like, damn. And then when Jason sent me a message, I was like, oh, you're that guy. Oh, that sucks.
Yeah.
If anything, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Jason.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, if anything, it just speaks very highly of the Nationals organization, not just from what the fans see, what the players and the managers and the conditioning staff, but behind the scenes, it shows that they really, really care. And kind of like what you guys said, it's what I'm getting out of this, because I definitely can tell you that I'm trying everything that I can do. I've talked to Max several times about what I can do to better myself in a sense of not just my baseball IQ, but provide something to the table in the baseball industry once I graduate that is different and unique. So basically what I'm getting out of this is, even though it might sound a little cheesy, basically just respect one another. Respect goes a long way. Treat others with kindness. And pretty much don't try and act like someone that you're not. Like, don't pretend to be something that you're not. Just be yourself, basically.
Don't pretend to be the smartest guy in the room either. They don't. Yeah. You don't know more than these people. Don't try and act like you do.
If you're the smartest guy in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Yes, that is the best. Live by those words. I have tried to live by those words. And luckily, every time I'm in a room with Jason, I will know I'm not the smartest guy in the room.
I don't know if that's true, but I appreciate the compliment.
Can I get some intel from you guys before we wrap up this podcast?
If you're wanting trade secrets on the Nationals,
no.
We don't know that information. Not that we could give it anyway.
Wink, wink, right?
Yeah.
I need to know who is running the Nationals social media team, because they literally have probably the best social media account in baseball.
I have no idea.
I have no idea.
I think that's a perception that I think people have about working for a sports team, is like the sports side and then the business side are like intertwined. They're not. I had no interaction with anybody on the business side at all. If you want to know anything about their marketing department, I would simply tell you, you're asking the wrong guy. But whoever does run that social media account, give them a raise, because they're very good at their job.
No kidding. All right. Thank you guys for being here. This means a lot to me. Not only
no problem. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for letting us explain the stat and show off how much fun it is to work in baseball.
Yeah, no kidding about that. You guys just seem to be having a blast. You guys are having the most fun of your life, and that's honestly that's just like something that, for me personally, I can't speak for anyone else, but for me personally, as a big baseball fan as I am, big nerd as I am, seeing how happy you guys are and seeing how happy other people are and how successful they are, that just only pushes me and motivates myself to do, things that you guys are doing, and, set an example for, generations, after me. So definitely thank you guys for the podcast. I definitely would love to have you guys on. Honestly, you could probably ask me, and I wouldn't even, bat an eye. I'd be like, okay, let's do one right now. Like I'm fine with it. I'm open to talking with anybody. So
maybe we'll have that whole Chapman Arenado debate, and we can talk about why Coors Field isn't that big of a deal.
Yes. The Chapman Arenado debate I think is fun just because it's like maybe the differences in hitters aren't much and maybe the gloves aren't much, but I keep telling people this. When it comes to player evaluation, when you're talking about the elite of the elite, the differences are minute. The differences are small. Like if you prefer a player A to player B, that's fine. I got no issue with that. Like, but just don't go about just saying like, Dillard knows because for some reason, I don't know why, once a month we have to have this conversation about Mike Trout and Ken Griffey Jr. for some weird reason. And it's not even, I love Ken Griffey Jr. It's just when you look at the numbers, it's one thing if they're like close. It's another one that's just not. When a guy is 2 wins better by WAR per 150 and like a 30-point better weighted runs created plus, the difference in glove should be like Kevin Kiermaier versus like Charlie Blackmon level glove. Like you got to be talking a huge difference in glove to make up that gap.
Ken Griffey was just so smooth, man.
He was, and he's like, don't get me wrong. If you're talking about who has a bigger impact, it's Ken Griffey Jr. He was without a doubt a star in baseball and in life because of how smooth and charismatic and just cool he was. But if you're asking me who's a better baseball player,
yeah. And Mike Trout's what? He's not even 30 yet. He's 29. So it's like
no Mike Trout slander ever.
I don't want to date myself, but I don't know if either of you have seen Little Big League, but I don't know if Mike Trout could pull off the Ken Griffey Jr. role in that movie.
You might have a point. You might have a point. Good movie.
All right. Well, thank you again, guys, for having you guys on the podcast. Definitely, hopefully in the near future, I can have you guys on here again and maybe make this like a routine thing, every other month or something like that. As long as you guys would want to do it, I'm all on board for it. But this has been podcast number 23 with Max and Jason. My name is Dillard, and we're signing off. I'm seeing you guys later. Have a blessed night. And you guys have anything else you want to say before we go and cut this?
Wear a mask.
Stay
safe.
A mask, everybody.
Social distance. Wear a mask.
All right. Wear a mask and enjoy the rest of your night, folks.